and Jeremy Nicholson. Welcome to this Net Zero Carbon podcast. Today we're talking about guides and insight, and I'm joined by sustainability expert Nick Fedson.
Hi, Jeremy.
Well, thanks for joining us, Nick. These guides and insights, what's this all about? I've had a look myself at the first couple, and you're the author of these, I understand. What's the purpose behind it all?
What we're doing at netzerocarbon.com is introducing, for anyone who works for a company that wants to have an introduction to corporate sustainability, we're giving them an overview of the basic concepts that are driving corporate sustainability. We're giving them a look at why businesses have an especially important role to play in global decarbonization, and basically the best possible introduction that they can have to the subject. We try to explain corporate decarbonization in simple terms, free from jargon, using language that everybody can access, that is for the broadest possible audience. So we introduce the core concepts, we introduce why businesses have a key role in sustainability, and what we'll be introducing in the third chapter, which will be getting released soon, is now that there is a basic understanding of decarbonization and why businesses are important to it. What are some of the tools that a business needs to use to build up a strategy for decarbonization that is the foundation for all of their actual decarbonization efforts?
Indeed, and this is a hugely important area. This is the part where businesses are actually starting to plan what they're going to have to do. What are the building blocks then of a decarbonisation strategy that we should expect to see in this guide?
What I would say is that, and what's actually reflected by the work that we do ourselves to support decarbonisation, is that this third chapter is very focused on data and measurement and accounting. So any plan to reduce emissions has to be founded on a robust methodology for measuring those emissions, accounting for them in some way, and then being able to monitor how they change over time. And it also needs to be accompanied by a well-defined target for how those emissions are going to reduce. Now, what we have included in Chapter 3 so far that will be getting released is an introduction to emissions accounting, just the kind of concepts that organizations use to what's called inventory their greenhouse gases. Now, countries have their own methodologies for inventorying their greenhouse gases that can't be applied to corporations for different reasons. But what is the global standard for accounting for emissions in companies is what is often known as the GHG protocol. That's really a misnomer. The GHG protocol is an NGO that develops standards for greenhouse gas accounting. And the one that it develops for use by organizations is called the GHG corporate standard. This is the international, globally accepted standard. It mirrors a standard from the ISO, but the GHG corporate standard is what most companies will think about when they're classifying their GHG emissions. So we go into the GHG corporate standard just by describing the three GHG scopes, which are now ubiquitous when companies are talking about reducing their emissions. So to pair with an introduction to emissions accounting through the GHG corporate standard is a piece that describes corporate climate targets. So any company that wants to get started with its own decarbonization needs to have a way to think about the destination for its emissions. And we talk about a couple of different options that companies can use to set climate targets, namely net zero targets and science-based targets. And both of those are integrated into the language used by the GHG protocol is inseparable from a discussion of net zero targets or science-based targets. So these are just the basic concepts that need to be used if you're developing a framework for your own decarbonization.
Sure. And just, for those who may be less familiar with the technology, you mentioned the three scopes involved, and these are presumably to do with the direct emissions associated with a business and the indirect emissions associated with, transporting goods and the wider supply chain and so on. And the science-based targets to which you refer, they would have presumably to cover all of those emissions. Is that right?
Well, in theory, the GHG corporate standard and its three scopes creates a way for a company to categorize all of its possible emissions. That's not to say that using the corporate standard allows the emissions from all companies across all three scopes to be sort of summed up across a country, because the corporate standard only exists to track emissions at the individual company level. But science-based targets do have to consider scope 3 emissions, which I'll just define them are all the indirect emissions that a company is associated with. And these can be both upstream and downstream indirect emissions. Science-based targets do have to consider scope 3 emissions if the scope 3 emissions of an organization account for greater than 40% of the total of its emissions across all three GHG scopes. But that's not to say that the corporate standard can be used as a national inventorying tool, should we say, because one organization's scope 1 emissions can be another's scope 3 emissions. So you can't just sum them all up. But this is all made more clear in the guide on the corporate standard itself.
I imagine a number of people, interested in emissions accounting for their own business will be relieved to know that there's some guidance and an attempt to simplify this for people who won't have been involved in this before. And having developed a strategy, presumably then we're into the realms of implementing it. And I gather that may be the subject of the next paper. Is that so? That's
right. So what the 3 chapters on netzerocarbon.com, once they've been released, will have done, like I said before, will be to have introduced sustainability, decarbonization, climate change, the role that the private sector has to play in decarbonization, and the basic tools that an individual company needs to have a good grasp of to effectively manage its own decarbonization. So these are an important foundation for implementation. And what we do in the 4th chapter, when it gets released, is actually describe some of these implementation measures using the language that the 3 preceding chapters will have been using. And the intention of that is to provide some content on actual emissions reductions measures that are thought-provoking, that are more interesting than a run-of-the-mill energy efficiency guide that you might see published that suggests that an organization should swap out its fluorescent lighting with LED lighting. Now, that sort of content is important, but we would like to present a little bit more of a thought-provoking approach to decarbonization measures that a company might adopt. So we use the language that netzerocarbon.com uses up to that point, in the sense that we'll be talking about emissions reduction measures across each of the 3 GHG scopes, how those might relate to one another. We talk about market-based solutions for emissions reductions, all sorts of interesting stuff. We'll have pieces on behavior change, pieces on asset auditing. There should be lots of interesting content up there.
Great. Well, Nick, as ever, thank you for your insights. This is a complex area for non-experts, but I suspect many of us are going to have to become more expert as this agenda takes hold, as it certainly will do over the years ahead. And so anything that helps businesses get to grips with this is extremely useful. So, I'm very, very glad these guides are out there, and look forward to seeing subsequent guides very shortly. Well, if you're interested in what we've been discussing about, do head off to netzerocarbon.com to download the guides and insights and all sorts of other interesting material on there, which I think will be useful to so many businesses as we join this journey towards net zero.